Okay, so we're starting the second of the 48 ways to acquire wisdom. The second one is Shmias Ha'ezen. Shmias Ha'ezen means hearing with the ears, which is, kind of strange terminology. What else are we going to hear with? So, um, when we talk about Shmiya, we're talking about as in the Lashon of Shema. Shema means to not just hear, but as they would say in Yiddish, to deher, to understand something, to focus on it, to pay attention to it, to get clarity of the idea. So the first step of effective listening is obviously to listen to what's being said and make sure you understand the other person's point of view. In negotiating, there's a concept, a tactic called active listening, where during the course of the negotiation, you hear what the other person says. You say, hold a minute, I just want to make sure I understand what you're saying. You repeat it to them to ensure that you actually have it. So you avoid being distracted, you avoid pushing your argument, and you make sure to understand what the other person's saying before you accept or reject an idea. Making sure that you understand it is step one of this. Step two of Shmias Ha'ezen, hearing with your ears, really hearing, is to define your terms. A lot of times we hear people say things and we react viscerally without really thinking about what things mean. Reb Noach gives the example of meeting a tourist who had been in Israel for the first time and had been all over the country. And he says to Reb Noach, they call this the Holy Land, but I went up north, I went down south, I went to Jerusalem, I went to Masada, and there's nothing holy at all about this place. So Reb Noach turns to the person and says, let me ask you something. Are you a bafuf stick? So the guy says, what's that? So Reb Noach says, no, just answer me. Are you a bafuf stick? So the guy says, I don't even know what a bafuf stick is. How could I answer if I'm one? So Reb Noach says, so tell me, what's holiness? Is it angels flapping their wings with, rainbows and unicorns? Now, what exactly is holiness? How are you going to define if this land is holy if you don't understand what it actually means? Right? So defining your terms is really critical. A person says, I don't need religion because I'm a good person. Well, what does a good person mean? Right? It's okay to be a good person, but not to be an Eved Hashem. What does good mean? Right? Without a definition of what that means, right? I'm in love and I think I want to marry her. What's love? What's marriage? Right? Saying a religious Jew is intolerant. Well, what's the definition of tolerance? Right? So that's step one is define your terms. Step two is the I, you, he game. Um, we tend to see ourselves as white, someone else we're talking to as gray, and someone else who's not here as black. For instance, you're in a car careening down a mountain road at 90 miles an hour, screeching around you're holding on to the dashboard for dear life, and you turn to the person next to you and you say, aren't you a bit foolhardy? And he turns to you and says, no, what do you mean? I'm brave. I'm not afraid of anything. When you get out of the car, if you're lucky enough to survive, you turn to your other friend and you say, he is a reckless idiot. So the driver thought of himself as brave. You thought of him, or at least were willing to say to his face, he's foolhardy. But when talking to someone else, you called him a reckless idiot. Which one is true? So if you don't define brave, foolhardy, and reckless idiot, how are you going to ever figure out which one is true? So defining bravery is, well, someone who does something, a necessary risk for a worthwhile purpose. Running into a firefighter, running into a building to save a child is obviously a brave thing to do. Foolhardy is to do an unnecessary risk for an important cause. So, for instance, a civilian without the proper gear running into the same burning building to save someone, yeah, brave, but pretty foolhardy. And then finally, a reckless idiot is someone who does unnecessary risks for no worthwhile purpose, like someone who runs into the burning building just to watch the flames and see the beams fall, right? That would be an idiot. So back to the car, right? Was the person brave? Were they foolhardy? Were they a reckless idiot, right? So again, if you were able to say to the person, is it really worth risking our life going down this road at 90 miles an hour, right? They might think twice about whether they're really being brave. The next idea of Shmias Ha'ezen is back to basics. It's never too late to get some of these concepts down pat. So, for instance, what is free will? What is bechira? right? A lot of us talk about it, but what does it really mean? So obviously, according to the Torah, it's the choice between good and evil. But does anyone really get up in the morning and say, today, what evil can I perpetrate? Right? We don't really do that. So how does free will relate to us? Well, it's the choice that we make between what our neshama, what our soul wants to do, and what our body feels like doing, right? So once you have context, once you have definitions for it, you can ask yourself, is what I am doing now what my soul wants to do, or is it more because what I feel like doing? So what I feel like doing is staying in bed an extra hour or chilling and, escaping, and killing time. That's what I feel like doing. What does my soul want to do? Well, it wants to pick up that book or that sefer or do that chesed, right? So understanding definitionally what it is that a person's free will is really allowing them to do is a critical factor. So again, back to basics means even concepts that we think we understand, make sure we understand them. If not, be mature enough, if you will, to go back and really understand and define them. The last idea is to extract insights, meaning if we're having our ears open at all times, that means looking at life with open ears, so to speak. When we read something, when we experience something, listen to it. Understand what we're experiencing. What am I taking out of it? Right? A lot of times you can read a book, learn a sefer, have a discussion, and 5 minutes later we have no recollection of what it was about, even though we spent 90 minutes doing it. So defining what it is that we got out of it, taking a moment to recap it in our head, allows us to internalize what we just gained. Second aspect of extracting insights is listen to the events in your life. If something happens to you, define what you learned from that happening, right? You lose a job, you gain a friend. What do we learn from those things? What was the experience? What did I feel? What can I take away from that I can apply to the rest of my life? Do I have to work on my interpersonal skills? Maybe I didn't work hard enough for this boss. Maybe there was skill sets that I was missing. Whatever it may be, if you don't bother if you just viscerally react to your new reality, but don't bother to look at the insights of what caused that reality, you're missing an opportunity to extract insight from life. And then finally, listen to what other people say. So this again goes back to that concept of active listening. Find whatever technique works for you, but ultimately make sure that you're actually internalizing what other people say, whether you agree or disagree. Reach a point where you're basing that decision to agree or disagree on a reality of what they were actually saying, as opposed to how you instantly reacted to what you thought you heard. So for Shmiras Ha'eizin, a couple of ideas are: one, find a couple of terms, pick 2 terms, and define them for yourselves. Really get to the bottom of what they actually mean. What does good mean? What does free will mean? Whatever it may be, marriage, happiness. 2, play the are you he game, right? Look at some situations that happen and look at how you see them in the context of yourself, in the context of someone that you are conversing with directly, and in the context of someone who may be outside of you. And ask yourself whether your viewpoint shifts based on who you're looking at, and then what is objective reality? How should you be viewing those things, once again, by defining your terms? And then ultimately, try to take a moment to think about the most important definition of all. Why are we here? What are we trying to accomplish in this world? Right? With that definition, a person can live an intentional life, a life of Shmiras Ha'eizin.